The Titanic is arguably the most famous ship ever sunk in the ocean, a luxury liner that was destined for doom. At 11:40 on April 14, 1912, the mighty Titanic hit an iceberg. By 2 a.m. the next morning, April the 15th, the Titanic had sunk and gone to the bottom of the sea. We've all heard this story many times before, but here are some stories that you may not have heard of. There were 3 ships in the area near the Titanic when it sunk, but only one ship turned up. The Carpathian was the ship that rescued all the survivors from the Titanic. The California, warned of icebergs 14 miles away, did not respond. They thought conditions weren't favorable, it was dark, and the crew was convinced that nothing had really happened. And then there's the Samson. The Samson was only 7 miles away. Why didn't it respond? They were on a seal hunting mission and did not want to get caught. Frederick Fleet was the lookout at the time. He didn't have any access to binoculars at all. The ship's second officer was replaced at the last minute and forgot to hand off the keys to the locker. The key has resurfaced at an auction in 2007 where it was sold for $90,000. There was a lot of famous people on board this ship at the time. One was silent actress Dorothy Gibson. She was among the 700 survivors. As soon as she got back to New York City, she began filming Saved from the Titanic. It was released in May 1912, just a month after the crash. She's famous for wearing the same clothes and shoes in the movie that she had worn in the actual sinking. The film was very successful at the time, but unfortunately, the only known print of the film was destroyed by fire. There have been 3 other films made about the Titanic as well. Gene Negulesco's Titanic was made in 1953. Roy Baker's A Night to Remember was made in 1958 and is thought to be the most accurate of the movies. And of course, James Cameron's Titanic was made in 1997.
What did you see?
Iceberg, dead ahead, sir.
Lucky-handed poker. A very lucky hand.
All life is a game of luck.
One person that wasn't famous was Chief Baker Charles Jawkin. He was in his bunk when the collision happened. He sent his 13 bakers with provisions of loaves of bread to go to the lifeboats. He was assigned to lifeboat number 10. He began helping the women and children aboard the boat. He went to the A deck and forcibly brought up women and children and threw them into the lifeboat, as people didn't believe the Titanic was sinking and did not want to be out in the cold. Well, lifeboat number 10 filled up and he had no place to go, so he went underneath and drank a whole bunch of liquor. He came back up and went to the deck and started throwing deck chairs overboard so they could be used as flotation devices. When he went to the pantry to get a drink, he heard a loud crash. He came out and the people were running everywhere. As the ship began to crack and buckle and fold in half, people went flying. He grabbed the safety rail and began to climb. He climbed up to the end of the boat. As it finally sank, Jawkin rode it down as if it were an elevator, not getting his head under the water. He said it may have been wetted, but no more. He was the last survivor to leave the Titanic. He was able to tread water and paddle for 2 hours in that freezing water. He said he hardly felt the cold at all. The alcohol might have helped. Another person that's not so famous is Violet Jessup. She began working as a stewardess on the White Star Liner's sister ship, Olympic. Well, as the Olympic was leaving Southampton, it collided with a British warship, HMS Hawke. There were no fatalities, but a lot of damage. She was then transferred to the Titanic as a stewardess at age 24. It struck the iceberg, as we know, and she survived. Later in the First World War, she was a stewardess for the British Red Cross. She was aboard the HMHS Britannica, which was a sister ship to the Olympic and the Titanic. It had been converted to a ship hospital. It sank because it hit a German naval mine. As it was sinking, Jessup and some of the other passengers were nearly killed by the ship's propellers as it was shredding lifeboats. She jumped off and unfortunately had a traumatic head injury, but she did survive. One story that's kind of odd is only 4 women from the first class perished. One of those 4 women was Anne Elizabeth Isham. She perished because she refused to leave her dog behind. 2 brothers survived the ship without a guardian. Edmund and Michael Navarrete were the only 2 that went down in history to survive the Titanic without a parent. They were nicknamed the Titanic Orphans. One sad story was a survivor named Masabumi Hasano. He was a 42-year-old civil servant from Tokyo. As the ship was going down, he was starting to think his own demise. But suddenly an officer yelled from one of the lifeboats, "Room for 2 more," and he boarded. As he boarded, he started witnessing the horror. Later in life, he was ridiculed for saving himself. But when he was rescued, he took some Titanic stationery that he'd saved in his pocket and began writing down the events that he saw while he was rowing away in the boat. He wrote, "On that cold and terrifying April night, in a single moment, I seized an opportunity and I chose life. We rowed at least 200 feet away from the sinking vessel. From our position, I clearly saw the Titanic as it broke apart, then plunged beneath the waves. As the frightful chills and cries from the drowning met my ears, I bowed my head in silence. Sobbing and weeping engulfed our small boat." These writings were discovered by his family in 1997 and they had them published. Upon this act, it immediately restored his honor and credibility. Some men were accused of dressing up as women to get aboard the lifeboats. William Sloper was a newspaperman from New York. He was accused of dressing as a woman to get on a lifeboat. However, Dorothy Gibson, the silent actress, had invited him instead. J. Bruce Ismay was the managing director of the White Star Line. He stepped aboard a collapsible lifeboat as it was being loaded into the water, so he didn't really take the place of anyone who might otherwise have been saved. William Clark and Dickinson Bishop have been accused of dressing up as women. This was based on rumors because they both got divorced immediately after this incident. The women both cited divorce because of the less than honorable behavior that night during the Titanic sinking. One person that could go down as being dressed as a woman, but he didn't do it himself, was Daniel Buckley. He lived because a woman in a lifeboat threw a shawl over him. Her action hid the presence from officers who were firing shots and ordering men off the boats or die.
Shoot any man who tries to get past me, get back!
Of course, we all know the most famous survivor, Molly Brown. She gained her wealth through gold mines. When she got to the Carpathia, the boat that rescued the survivors, she began raising money from the more wealthy to help the poorer passengers. Her acts of heroism made news, and it earned her the nickname the unsinkable Mrs. Brown. One of the people that did not go was Milton Hershey. Yes, the very Milton Hershey of the candy company. Another one was Alfred Vanderbilt, the millionaire. And another one was J.P. Morgan, the owner of the White Star Line. He stayed at a spa in France. As the ship was going down, musicians played for more than 2 hours. It's thought that the last song they played was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Among the 6,000 artifacts was a violin, possibly belonging to one of the musicians. It sold in auction for $1.7 million. Well, the Last Supper served to the first-class passengers was an 11-course meal. It had hors d'oeuvres like oysters, main course such as filet mignon, and desserts like chocolate and vanilla eclairs. Captain Edward Smith was associated with the canceled lifeboat drill that day. No one is really sure about his last hour, but we all know of his command, women and children first. The sad thing is, he was going to retire right after this voyage. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there.
Personally, I don't believe this conspiracy theory.
One of the conspiracy theories is that it may have been torpedoed by a German sub and never even hit the iceberg. There was predictions of it sinking even before it happened. A passenger named William Stead had foreseen his own death in the Titanic. This is apparently suggested in 2 fictional sinking stories which he wrote decades earlier. The first was in 1886, how the mail steamer went down in the mid-Atlantic by a survivor. It tells of a mail steamer's collision with another ship. The other one was From the Old World to the New in 1892. And of course there was a book written about this. Morgan Robinson had written the book Futility. It was revised as The Wreck of the Titan in 1912. It features a fictional British ocean liner named the Titan that sinks in the North Atlantic Ocean after striking an iceberg of all things. While some say the Titanic was cursed because the White Star Line did not practice christening of their ships. Another legend is that the Titanic was transporting a cursed unlucky mummy Egyptian artifact from the British Museum to New York. However, that artifact in question is still in the British Museum today. Now here's probably the craziest conspiracy theory of them all. The Titanic might have possibly been sunk to eliminate opposition to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Some of the wealthiest men in the world were aboard the Titanic at the time. Those would have included John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidore Straus, the man who created Macy's. They were allegedly opposed to the creation of the U.S. central banking system. Now it suggests that J.P. Morgan, the owner of the White Star Line, arranged to have the men board the ship and then sink it to eliminate them. Another theory is that the ship that sank was actually the sister ship of the Titanic, the Olympic. It's suggested that the Olympic went down as an elaborate insurance scam by the owners. Well, the stories of survival, heroism, and some wild conspiracy theories have all aided to the legend of the Titanic. That is strange indeed. Thanks for watching. We'll keep the videos coming here on Strange History. Hey, check out this video on the history of Jekyll Island.